In 1985, the legendary musician Ryuichi Sakamoto looked back at a movement called futurism, a world of machinery, speed, and noise that eventually spiraled into the arms of Italian fascism. He asked a haunting question: has the futurist dream truly ended? Sakamoto, a man who championed the boundary-pushing ideas of postmodernism, felt a flicker of vigilance. He saw that when we celebrate acceleration and innovation without a moral anchor, we risk opening a door to a very old kind of darkness. Fast forward to today, and you've likely seen this scene play out on your own screen. Someone is presented with an ironclad fact data, footage, or historical record, and instead of engaging with it, they simply shrug. That's your truth, they say. Or worse, they dismiss the information as a fake simply because it doesn't align with the internal hum of their own emotions. At first glance, it looks like the ultimate intellectual freedom, the right to define your own reality. The person seems empowered, almost defiant, standing on the bedrock of their own conviction. But then you notice the shift. The moment a voice from the other side enters the room, that sense of empowerment turns into a sharp, jagged hostility. It's no longer about a peaceful coexistence of ideas. It's about the total exclusion of anyone who doesn't mirror their feelings. The other is no longer a human being to be understood, but a noise to be silenced. What started as a noble philosophical attempt to respect diversity has inverted into something unrecognizable. We've moved from the power of knowledge to the violence of ignorance. It's a world where truth isn't shared in a common space anymore. It's been privatized, locked away in a solipsistic bunker. But how did the very ideas meant to dismantle dogmatism end up building the most rigid emotional walls we've ever seen? To understand the intellectual poverty of our post-truth era, we have to look at the one thing we've collectively decided to delete: the ethical weight of the person who disagrees with us. That concept right there, the violence of ignorance, I think that's where we have to start. It really frames the entire mission for this deep dive.
It does. And we should be clear, we're not just here to sort of lament how things are, complain about political discourse or arguments on the internet.
No, not at all. The goal here is to actually dismantle the mechanics, to look under the hood and see why this is happening.
We're looking at what feels like a structural collapse in how we relate to each other.
Yeah.
And to do that, we're pulling from a whole stack of sources: evolutionary psychology, behavioral economics, digital sociology.
And it's not just structural, right? It's biological.
It is. I mean, the core idea we have to explore is this concept of an evolutionary mismatch.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly?
It means we're essentially running Stone Age software on modern digital hardware. These are ancient survival instincts, designed for small bands on the savannah.
And now they're running in this hyper-connected world and glitching.
They're glitching out.
Mm-hmm.
The result is this bizarre tendency to psychologically delete the other, the person who disagrees with us, just to protect our own often fragile identities.
And along the way, the idea of truth itself has changed. It's not this objective standard anymore.
No, it's become an economic commodity. It's something you trade within your social hierarchy. And frankly, it's become a very, very costly one to hold on to.
Okay, so to really get how this engine of exclusion works, we have to start with the tribe. The weaponization of the tribe. I think the best way to ground this is with a story from the source material. It illustrates this perfectly.
Okay.
I was scrolling through some deep dive forums the other day and came across a story of a man we'll call Leo. Try to imagine Leo living in a hyper-connected yet strangely silent apartment in a modern metropolis. He is a casualty of what we call the modern sexual marketplace. After a series of rejections, Leo didn't find solace in self-reflection. He found a digital tribe. Within this echo chamber, women were no longer individuals with agency, the other, but were reduced to biological variables and cold statistics. I heard that Leo eventually stopped seeing the women he met as human beings at all. They became targets in a gamified reality. His tribe provided him with a shield of tribalism, weaponizing his loneliness to disrupt his ability to make rational decisions. Looking at this as someone who covers these digital shifts, it's chilling to see how easily our ancient need for a tribe can be hijacked by an algorithm. While I understand the deep pain of isolation that drives men like Leo into these corners, we have to recognize that when we stop seeing the other as a person, we aren't just winning a social game, we are losing our grip on objective reality itself. It's a defensive mechanism that feels like power, but is actually a retreat into a hall of mirrors.
Leo's story is, well, it's tragic. But if we look at it clinically, it's a textbook manifestation of something called the male warrior hypothesis.
That sounds a little like an action movie title.
It does, but it's a very serious framework in evolutionary psychology, and it helps explain how this constant competition between groups shaped our minds.
So let's unpack that. It suggests that our psychology, specifically male psychology, was forged in conflict.
Right. And there's a specific structural reason for that, and it's tied to how our ancestors lived. It all comes down to a concept called patrilocality.
Patrilocality, okay.
So in our ancestral environment, females would often move to the males group when they paired off. The males, on the other hand, tended to stay in the group where they were born.
Ah, so over generations, you end up with a group of men who are all related. Brothers, fathers, cousins.
Exactly. They were genetically related, and that means the biological incentive to defend that group was just immense.
You're not just fighting for your friends, you're fighting for your own DNA.
And that genetic stake created this very powerful, very fast us versus them heuristic in the brain. It's a binary sorting system.
So you see someone and your brain immediately asks, in-group or out-group? Safety or threat?
Instantly. And this isn't just a cultural thing we learn. It's deep, deep architecture.
The research mentioned something called prepared learning, which I found pretty startling. It suggests we're biologically primed to learn certain fears more easily.
Yes, and that's really the smoking gun for the male warrior hypothesis. There are studies that show it's actually harder for people to unlearn a fear response to images of outgroup males than it is to unlearn a fear of snakes or spiders.
Wow, think about what that implies.
It implies that for millions of years, the single greatest threat to your survival wasn't a predator. It was a man from the next valley over.
And all of this aggression was historically tied to securing resources and, well, reproduction.
Right. Teaming up coalitional aggression was a direct strategy to secure mates. So now look at Leo. He's failing in the modern sexual marketplace. He feels rejected, isolated.
And his brain interprets that as a huge survival failure.
A critical one. So what does it do? It seeks a coalition. He's sitting alone in a silent apartment.
Yeah.
But that digital tribe activates those exact same ancient circuits.
And so joining this online group that's hostile towards an out-group, in his case, women, it feels like he's part of that ancestral brotherhood again. It feels like he's winning.
It feels like a fitness benefit. It feels like he's finally taking action to secure his status. But the cost...
The cost is the complete dehumanization of the target. The story says women became biological variables.
Because they have to. That dehumanization is a necessary part of the aggression. You can't be ruthless towards someone you're empathizing with.
And this is where social identity theory comes in, right?
Yeah.
We get our sense of self from our groups.
It's a huge portion of it, yes. For Leo to feel good about his identity as a member of this new tribe, his group has to be superior. And for his group to be superior, the other group must be inferior.
And the algorithms, the forums, they're just supercharging this whole instinct. They exploit this thing called the outgroup homogeneity bias.
Which is, it's a tendency to see your own group as full of nuanced individuals. We all have different opinions, while seeing the outgroup as a monolith.
They're all the same.
They're all exactly the same. So to Leo, all women become interchangeable. They're like NPCs, non-player characters, to use the language you see in these spaces.
That term NPC is so telling. It literally turns other people into a game. If the other is an NPC, they don't have an internal life. They're just code, an obstacle.
And that provides what the research calls positive distinctiveness. Leo feels special. He thinks he's seen the code, that he understands the real hidden way the world works.
But like the story said, he's actually losing his grip on reality.
Completely. He's in a hall of mirrors. He just sees his own grievances reflected back, and the tribe demands he keeps that delusion alive to remain a member.
So this ancient drive gets hijacked by digital platforms, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. The other is what happens to our empathy when we scale this up to a global network.
Right, the sheer scale of the other we have to deal with now.
Which brings us to the next story, the story of Marco. I recently read a series of blog posts about a young architect in Milan named Marco, who became obsessed with the New Vitality, a modern echo of the early 20th century Italian futurists. Marco lived in a world of radical atomization. He had 5,000 followers, but didn't know the name of the elderly woman living in the apartment next to his. I heard that when a local crisis hit, Marco didn't feel a flicker of empathy. To him, the struggle of his neighbor was obsolete noise that slowed down the acceleration of progress. He had completely lost the ethical imagination required to see himself in another. In his mind, he was part of a superior, faster reality, where the weak were simply data points to be filtered out. This is a classic case of what scientists call an evolutionary mismatch. Our brains are wired for small group empathy, yet here we are, floating in a post-truth void where we can curate our own reality to exclude anyone who makes us uncomfortable. From my perspective behind the camera, I see Marco not as a villain, but as a warning. We are seeing the power of ignorance being justified as innovation. We must be careful. When we lose the ability to imagine the other's existence, we are repeating the darkest chapters of the last century under a different digital guise.
Obsolete noise. I mean, what a chilling phrase. But it's so revealing.
It is. And Marco's inability to feel for his neighbor, it's not just presented as a personal moral failing, it's framed as a structural problem.
It's the core of the evolutionary mismatch theory when it comes to empathy.
We talked about this mismatch earlier, but the numbers are key here. Our brains were built for a very specific social scale.
We evolved in what's called the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, or EEA. And for most of human history, that meant small nomadic bands. This is where Dunbar's number comes in.
Right, about 150 people. That was the hard limit on how many stable social relationships a human could maintain.
And in a group of 150, empathy is a survival tool. If someone gets hurt, you see it, you hear it. You can't ignore the suffering of someone you rely on every day.
But Marco lives in a world of what the sources call supernormal scale. He's connected to 5,000 people online. He's exposed to the lives and problems of millions more.
And the human brain cannot process empathy at that scale. It's not designed for it. It hits a breaking point. We call it compassion fatigue, but it's really more like a circuit breaker tripping.
So to even function, he has to filter people out. He has to turn them into data points.
He has to.
Okay.
Because if he actually felt the emotional weight of everyone he encountered online, he would just collapse.
And that creates another problem, supernormal distance.
Yes, the physical and psychological distance. In a real tribe, if you punish someone, you're right there. There are consequences. Online, Marco is atomized. He's floating. He can dismiss his actual physical neighbor as obsolete and never have to look her in the eye.
So morality itself changes. It stops being about what you do and starts being about what you say.
It becomes performative. It becomes what we call virtue signaling. When you're broadcasting to 5,000 strangers, your morality is about using the right jargon, showing the right symbols, signaling you're part of the new vitality group.
You can be a moral person online without ever doing a single thing to help another human being.
And that leads us to this huge philosophical shift, the privatization of truth.
Moving from a shared common space to what the text called a solipsistic bunker.
Exactly. We used to talk about the democratization of truth, the idea that many voices create a shared reality. But that's collapsed into only my truth exists.
And if truth is just defined by how strongly I feel about something,
then anyone who contradicts that feeling isn't just wrong. They're an existential threat.
This is that other of the other concept from the research.
It's the ability to imagine that the person you're dismissing, that they have a perspective on you, that they're a subject, not an object. Marco can't do that. His neighbor doesn't have an internal world to him. She's just an obstacle in his story.
And the technology, the algorithms, they just reinforce this by feeding us homogeneous pleasure. They show us what confirms our biases because it feels good.
It creates a community of emotion. We bond over shared outrage or shared feelings of superiority. But a community built on shared emotion is incredibly fragile.
Why is that?
Because it can only exist by constantly kicking out anyone who disrupts the emotional vibe. It gets rid of what the source calls ethical tension.
That friction, the discomfort of sitting with someone who sees the world differently.
Right. Real empathy is hard work. But the digital bunker lets us curate a world with no friction at all.
Which leads to the final and maybe the most cynical piece of this whole mechanic, the economics of it all.
The economics of delusion. We like to think we value truth, but the reality is it's often a luxury good that most people just can't afford.
This is where we get to the story of Elias, which I think is just a terrifying look at the cost of staying connected to reality. There's a fascinating, albeit tragic, case I saw discussed in a behavioral economics seminar regarding a corporate analyst named Elias. Try to imagine Elias sitting in a high-stakes meeting where everyone is cheering for a project that he knows factually is failing. The cost of speaking the objective truth was immense. It meant social ostracization, the loss of his rank in the office hierarchy, and mental exhaustion. On the other hand, the cost of emotional conformity was almost zero. In fact, by nodding along and joining the anti-intellectual chorus, he received an immediate hit of dopamine from the group's approval. I heard that Elias eventually stopped even looking at the data. It was easier to let his brain atrophy into a state of willful ignorance than to pay the cognitive price of being right and alone. This is the low-cost dopamine of the post-truth era. As I reflect on Elias' story for my channel, it's clear that we are witnessing a shift where social hierarchy is no longer built on competence, but on the intensity of one's conformity to the group's truth. It's an uncomfortable reality to face, and while I empathize with the survival instinct to fit in to avoid the pain of exclusion, we have to ask ourselves, what happens to a society when the truth becomes a luxury no one can afford to buy?
You see, Elias isn't just a coward. From a certain point of view, he's a rational economic actor. He's responding to the incentives in his environment.
And this is what's called the economics of motivated beliefs.
Right. It's the idea that beliefs serve a function beyond just being accurate. We don't just believe things because they're true.
We believe them because they're useful.
Precisely. Beliefs have a supply and a demand. Elias demands the belief that this failing project is actually succeeding.
Why? What's the payoff?
It gives him what's called effective value. It reduces his anxiety, makes him feel safe, and it gives him instrumental value. It keeps his job, protects his status in the office tribe.
So the objective truth that the whole thing is a disaster actually has negative value for him. It brings stress, risk, isolation. So he makes a logical choice to pick the delusion.
But how does he supply that delusion to himself? He's an analyst. He knows the data is bad.
He uses strategic ignorance. The story says he eventually stopped looking at the data.
And that's the key mechanism. If you don't look, you don't have to actively lie to yourself. You can just maintain the preferred belief. You curate your own reality to protect your social standing.
It sounds like a corporate version of mutually assured destruction.
The source calls it mutually assured delusion, MAD. In that meeting, if everyone else is denying reality, the one person who speaks the truth becomes a public bad.
They're the killjoy.
They're inflicting a loss on the group's morale. So reality denial becomes a strategic complement. The more everyone else does it, the more incentive you have to do it too.
It's a feedback loop that feels impossible to break. And we have the classic Asch conformity experiments to back this up.
Yeah, Asch experiments are fundamental here. You put one real person in a room with actors who all agree on an obviously wrong answer, like saying a short line is longer than a long one.
And what, 75% of participants went along with the lie at least once?
75%. 3/4 of people will deny the evidence of their own eyes just to avoid social friction.
And there are two kinds of pressure there, right? There's normative social influence, just conforming to not get rejected. That's Elias's fear.
Right. But then there's informational social influence, which is maybe even more dangerous. That's when you start to think the group must know something you don't.
You start to gaslight yourself. If all these smart people are cheering, maybe I'm the one who's wrong.
And in the digital age, that just explodes into what we call availability cascades. A false belief gets repeated so often by so many people that it starts to feel true.
And suddenly, the cost of being objective is astronomical. To be the one person saying no when a million people are saying yes, I mean, most people don't have that kind of psychological capital.
You end up in a system where the person who climbs the ladder isn't the most competent one, but the one who conforms with the most intensity.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty bleak picture here. We've got biological instincts pushing us to tribalism, tech that strips away empathy, and economic structures that reward delusion. It feels like a trap.
It does feel like a trap. But the research stack does point toward a way out. It's just probably not the solution most people want to hear.
And it's definitely not the one the tech industry is selling us.
Not at all. The entire trend in AI and tech design right now is to make everything seamless, frictionless. We want an AI that's a polite, all-knowing butler. But the research on cognitive dissonance AI suggests that is exactly the wrong way to go.
Because that seamlessness is actually weakening our epistemic resilience. Is that the term?
It is. Think of it like a muscle. If you never lift anything heavy, your muscles atrophy. If you never have to wrestle with a contradictory idea, your ability to reason, to process reality, it atrophies too.
So systems that remove all that epistemic discomfort, they're actually making us intellectually weaker.
They're making us fragile. The proposal is that we need active struggle. Real intellectual growth only happens when you're forced to deal with contradictions.
So a cognitive dissonance AI wouldn't just give you the answer you want to hear. It would deliberately present you with the counter evidence.
It would force you to sit with the discomfort of competing truths, which, yes, is a massive shift in mindset, but we're capable of it.
Right. The source, Our Moral Fate, argues against what it calls the tribalism dogma.
Which is this fatalistic idea that we're just robots programmed for hate because of the male warrior hypothesis. But that ignores adaptive plasticity.
Our moral minds are flexible.
Incredibly flexible. Under the right conditions, security, education, reduced threat, we can expand our circle of moral regard. We can build inclusive moralities. We are not doomed to become Leo or Marco.
But to do that requires an ethical recovery, not just a factual one. It's about returning to that idea of the inversion of knowledge.
The antidote to post-truth isn't just more facts. You can't fact-check Elias into being brave when his job is on the line. The antidote is ethical. It's about recovering the other of the other.
It's about finally recognizing that the person you disagree with is not an NPC, not a data point. They're a human with an internal world just as complex as yours.
And that means moving from the privatization of truth back toward building a common world.
Which requires us to understand the depth of emotion driving people into these bunkers in the first place.
If we can understand the pain that drives Leo, or the fear that drives Marco, we can stop seeing monsters and start seeing the glitched software. And maybe then we can start the hard work of rebuilding.
We have covered a huge amount of ground today, from our ancestral genetics to corporate boardrooms. But before we wrap up, we want to leave you with one final thought.
We live in a world that is constantly, relentlessly optimizing for your comfort. Your news feed, your smart assistant, everything is designed to smooth out the edges of your reality, to make you feel validated and safe.
In a world like that, the most radical act you can commit isn't shouting your opinion louder.
It's to deliberately seek out psychological discomfort. It's to let your reality be genuinely challenged by the weight of another human being.
True intellectual freedom isn't the right to define your own truth.
It's the strength to let your truth be broken and then rebuilt together.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.